Greetings, friends, bread of life, the Lord be with you all. What did Moses say when he broke the two tablets of stone in the law? He said, don't worry about it. I've got a backup in the cloud. Now, if you laughed at that, you've been cooped up too long and you need to get outside, because that's a terrible joke. But it is one I found of many jokes and anecdotes around the Ten Commandments. And it's just evidence of the fact that no other law code, I think that's very easy to claim, no other law code, no other moral teachings have saturated the globe in our history in time. And so they're familiar to all. Martin Luther, the reformer, once said that he who knows the Ten Commandments knows all of Scripture. And so our readings today lead us into reflections on the law. We had a class on Friday about this, Professor Oliver O'Donovan we welcome. So there's some overlap there, and it's a time in the week and a time in Lent where we reflect on this. Our Old Testament reading is Exodus 20, 1-17, that giving of the Ten Commandments, and Moses gives them to Israel. Psalm 19, the reflection on the movements of the sky and the order of the law. John chapter 2, Jesus cleansing the temple, and then Romans 7, where Paul thinks through the goodness of the law, but our inability to keep it. We'll go back to this passage in Exodus and first give the side of the beauty, of the goodness, the necessity of the law, and then come in the second part of the sermon to reflect on the complexity of it and how we're supposed to live and draw on it or apply it to our lives today. So first of all, the giving of the law. What's the purpose of this law? John Calvin once said that it is evidence, it's the means for us to show forth the glory of God in our lives. And in the fall, I preached a series of 6 or 7 sermons on the Ten Commandments to try and do this, to show that if you actually study the law rather than just reading them flatly, they open up all these different areas and windows of moral reflection, of ways that we live in the world. Just in brief summary, think if we move through these, the Decalogue, through these commandments, the way they order our lives. This is medieval church language. They give order and shape to our lives. And the first law above all else is the law that we are creatures and God is the creator. We're his debtors. We belong to him. Our very identity is people who reflect his image. And so our lives ought to be exclusively lived in worship and honor of him. The things we desire, the things we orient to, the things we think about ought to be oriented to this good creative God, the lawgiver himself. But then it orders our speech, the things we say about God and the things we say about our neighbors, the way we speak truthfully, the way we use our words or don't use them and withhold our speech, the way we Twitter and tweet and post and blog ought to be somehow ordered, the law says. Our time, our work and our rest, the rest we give to others, the seasons we observe as a way of honoring the creation and the cultures and the economies around us. It orders family. It orders life and death, sexuality. It orders our possessions, what we have, what we keep, what we give. It orders our desire of things. I mean, you think about the scope that these simple 10 commandments order around us: speech and desire, life, possessions, goods, creation, culture. And the law has that beautiful aspect to it. That's what the psalm is trying to get at. Psalm 19 today, it says the firmament above declares his handiwork. The sky declares his speech. His word goes out into all the earth. That beckoning of God, the voice of God that's through the creation, that's through our scriptures, that speaks of the word, the order that we are meant to live in life, to reflect his image in the world. And that great picture of the sun, right, that runs its course. That's the image we're to have of the law. The sun runs its course through the day, and it abides in its tent at night. You see that orderedness? It turns right from the sun to say the law of the Lord is perfect, restoring human life. The fear of the Lord is righteous and good and purifying and altogether good. The statutes of the Lord. You see, the law, if it's lived correctly, brings about the flourishing, the goodness that we see in the sun when we see it in Ithaca on its rare occasions. But we know to long for it, we know to appreciate it because it knows its course. It knows its vocation, it knows its identity. And so the law does so for us. So that beautiful picture can be contrasted then to the New Testament and the complexity of law, especially in the Christian life. How do we live it? Do we live under it? And that was the substance of almost an hour and a half or 2 hours of dialogue on Friday, if you joined us. How complex, how difficult that is. In our reading in John 2, Jesus shows up at the temple, it says, and he goes in and he clears it out. He forms a whip. Mark's version of this doesn't have a whip, but in John's, he forms a whip and he drives out the money changers and all these animals. John, more than the other gospels, details all the animals, the livestock, the birds that are in this place. What's Jesus doing there? It's common in kind of popular preaching to say, well, this was an economic kind of manipulation, that people are being charged extraordinary costs in order to rob those who've come to Pentecost or come to the feast, to trade the animals for sacrifice, and so they're being robbed by them. Only John doesn't mention that, and the most recent history we actually have no evidence of that these great fees or charges were being laid down. All we have in John is he said, the traders, you've turned my house into a house of trade. It seems to me that the straightforward meaning is that we've adopted those aspects of the culture and made them part of the church. If the culture has this economic system, well, the church ought to also. I think my own opinion is there's a second, even deeper thing going on there in John. If you go to Deuteronomy's law about the festivals, there's 3 of them, Booths and Pentecost, and the feast of Passover. The Jews come each time to this feast, and they have to bring things to be sacrificed. And everyone has to bring something. And if you're poor, there's allotments for what you get to bring. And if you live a long way away, you can sell your own possessions there and take money and buy what you need for sacrifice at the courts. That's what the Pharisees are doing. That's what the money changers are doing in the temple. They're actually keeping the letter of the law. But in Deuteronomy's law, if you're poor, it says, you shall have something. You shall provide liberally for those. The whole point of these festivals in the law was generosity and mutual joy. That everyone's hand may have something to give. Everyone shall rejoice. Everyone shall eat. If this is Jesus' critique, this is my assumption, and others make it too. The trading, the economy, not even the misuse of the money or the abuse of it, it's simply the fact that you've totally lost sight of the purpose of the festival, which was mutual joy and generosity and rejoicing and sharing that happened at the feast. It's no longer served its purpose. I think at the real heart of John chapter 2, and of Jesus' own life, in fact, is that the letter of the law has taken precedence to the spirit of the law. The Jews at the temple are doing what the law allowed, but they've totally lost sight of its purpose, of its spirit, which was to unite the community, rich and poor, in sharing, in mutual joy. You can go back to these sermons, or the ones I preached on Deuteronomy 15, that illustrate that purpose of the law. And so Jesus is refreshing not just Judaism, but the globe with a new moment in history, where there'll be a new opportunity to rethink the relationship of spirit and law. It's perhaps tempting to think, well, then Jesus does away with the law altogether. Only that's not what we get from Jesus. We get a judgment around sin, around sexual immorality, around adultery, around greed, around foreign worship of other gods. Jesus upholds this law, but somehow he lives it in his spirit in ways that we had not seen before, that Jews had not seen. And I think that's what this reading brings us to. It's almost exactly what's going on in Romans 7. This long passage, if you know Romans, and we only get half of it today in our reading, but if you go back to the beginning, Paul begins his reflection. So then is the law good? Yes, indeed. The law is a good thing. You see, Psalm 19 was right. It orders our life in this beautiful way. But it's so hard to keep. We become legalists. We try and keep it to win God's favor, and it has no strength, no power in itself to help us keep it. But it's the Spirit within us that allows us to keep it. That's the wrestling through Romans 7 that'll run into chapter 8. God calls us to be moral people, but the law can't do it. And the law can blind us. And so the Spirit within us, the Spirit of the law, teaches us what to do, how to keep it, what the law is actually pointing at. And so that's where I think these passages leave us today, with that challenge, that dilemma. How do we live with both the spirit of the law and the letter of the law without abusing either one? If I were to apply it briefly to our culture today, I think that's not hard. We could think of the pandemic. Think of the most conservative side. It's error. If it's error, it's on the letter of the law. During this season, synagogues, churches I know insisted that the law of freedom of speech and religion allowed them to gather. And it does. And as a result of that, people we know were sickened. People we know died. Because this letter of the law said we could worship. The government can't take away our right to gather and to have the sacraments. No, that's probably true. The law allows us to gather. But what was the spirit of the law? To give of ourselves to protect the lives of others. It's not at all hard to see what the law was aiming at. Sure, governments pivoted and moved and were changing their opinions, and the medical experts were trying to get a hold of things, and so the policies were easy for us to be cynical and suspicious about. But the spirit of the law should have told us all along what we were to do. That is, to protect the lives of others. The laws themselves couldn't do that on their own. It took the Spirit to come alongside them, but it took the letter to give us some guidance, some direction on the kinds of things we should and shouldn't do. And so conservatives, particularly, insisted on their freedoms that the law provided and not the spirit of the letter that told us to love our neighbor. On the far progressive side of it, you could say it's all spirit and no letter. It's been a big moral experiment for the last 2 centuries to push these 10 commandments and the Judeo-Christian morality out of our culture. Philosophers, scientists, Darwin was deeply resentful of the 10 commandments. That doesn't diminish the insights that he had in science, but he was a part of this whole move to naturalize the world and get rid of these moral commandments that are authoritative from God, that would regulate our lives. And that's the progressive celebration today. Life in the Spirit, life of freedom, no law, no to the culture. Everything is free. And so the kind of moral shaping today, an article in the New York Times this week, comes to us in the form of the bloggers, the influencers. The Gwyneth Paltrow, she would be the poster child, especially for women, this blogging, tweeting culture of influencers whose mantra is, be free, be happy, be yourself. I mean, if there's not evidence of the disordered picture of life that Gwyneth Paltrow portrays for our culture, I don't know what is. There's no sense to it. There's no meaning. There's no neighbor. There's no path of the sun running its orbit. It's just this morass of freedom and happiness. And what's that resulted in? We actually have pretty good evidence about this. Nowhere has our experiment with this new anti-morality movement been worked and tested than with our children and with college students. Where the rule on the college campus today is be yourself, label yourself, find your identity, do your own thing. There are meaningful parts about finding ourselves and knowing our own expression, but there's no boundaries, no order to it. Mounting evidence today that our children, that our college students are bored and unhappy and vulnerable to mental illness at rates that stagger the mind, that have never been seen before. How's this life of freedom working out for us? I mean, a huge part of it is simply the absence of any boundaries in life. Students are said to do anything, and anything has no shape. When I was years ago, I sometimes tell the story, I was a survival instructor, and I was a survival student. And one of the main things that we used to have to do was we had to take our compasses, no GPS, and go at night from one point to the next, a couple of miles through the forest. And if you've ever done that, it's miserable, because when you follow the compass, you come into brambles and trees and forests that you would not want to cross. You run into swamps until your boots are full of mud. You go over hills that you could have very easily gone around, but you have to stay to the compass. There's no sense of a meaningful path. You're always looking for where you are and failure to get lost. And in those moments when you're walking and you see a path, a trail, it's so renewing, it's so safe, it's so secure, because I know the path has been made by somebody who can guide my way. You see, that's what the letter does for us. It guides us on a path. And if the most progressive sides of our culture have lost it, then there is something for the Christian church to do to point back to the orderedness of creation. The path. That's the metaphor of the sun. It knows its path. Imagine if we woke up and we said, the sun decided not to come up today, or to stay up all day and never relieve us of the burning heat. It has a tent, it has a season, it has a rhythm. So our lives do within the law. Lent brings us to this moment, to this challenge. No simple challenge at all. To live between the spirit and the letter. Not simply to do that, though, at this moment, as we have in our readings, it's to gaze on Christ as he did it, who could show up one day and cleanse the temple of its impurity, of its weak, thin letteredness of the law, and then come back only years later to die for those who ran it and to give away his life, to be full spirit, to gather, to welcome in love, to point to what the law always is aiming at, to bring about the glory of humanity. As we come back to live in that space, it's not to gain God's favor. It's to show the glory of God to the world around us. So I invite us into this season, this period in Lent, to think about our own relationship to the Spirit and to the letter, to the flourishing, to the order of the world that God desires for us. May he give us wisdom to live that well. Amen.